Associate professor, University of Wisconsin. Oof. From Wisconsin, Oshkosh. He is James Duke Pesta. Do you prefer to be called Duke or James or Jim or?
Duke, please. Thank you.
So Duke, I mean, I can't even imagine sitting in a class and receiving this. What is the reaction when you pass this out?
You know, it's interesting, and I respect the oof you gave me when you mentioned the University of Wisconsin. So that I appreciate that.
Yeah.
The response I get from kids is almost overwhelmingly what you said. They kind of, their eyes widen, they laugh a little bit, and a lot of them come. I had a kid, classes started for us this week, and so I had a kid when I gave it out yesterday for the first time who came up to me afterwards, and she wanted to know if I had 3 copies for her grandparents and her dad who are going to just love it. The response has been really positive, and I think these kids, even progressive kids, when I get liberal kids in my classes, they will say to me, you know, it's just nice to have an environment where we can talk about things without fear of having to please the professor.
So let me ask you this. I see these protests happening, and I see these classes that are being shut down, and people come in and they're like, chanting something, and then everybody has to chant back. And I've noticed that most of the students are not chanting back. It's almost like everybody's just like, oh, dear God, okay, just get it over with. Are the students today open to hearing other opinions? They're just not getting the chance to hear other opinions?
I think the really strong majority, the silent majority of college kids, they're paying for these classes. They've taken out student loans. They signed up for courses. They wouldn't have signed up for a course if they thought that course was going to just be nothing but insulting to them. So they signed up for courses in goodwill, and they're willing to give teachers, and more than teachers, they're willing to give books a fair hearing. It's a very small number of these protesters that seem to drive the reaction, and a lot of liberal kids I've talked to, a lot of my progressive students, they just roll their eyes at it. And so I think you're right, exactly, that it's a small number and they're very vocal. But I do think we have created, the faculty and the administration has allowed there to become a climate of fear. It's worse than McCarthyism. It's this argument, this idea that these kids know that if they make one false slip or they say the wrong thing or they use the wrong pronoun, God forbid, when they're addressing somebody, that they could be put into a very invasive investigation process. And so I think that the reason more kids aren't speaking out is because the faculty and the administration have the back of a handful of protesters at the expense of the vast majority of their own students.
What is this going to mean when they get out of school? If they're used to this and they've seen this work?
Well, I think we see it culturally, right? What is Antifa? What is the fact that you've got all these young social media executives, the 20-somethings who are working at Google and Facebook and Twitter, who gleefully go about their business censoring and pulling conservative websites off, loading algorithms to bury conservative news. I think you see it in our young athletes, right? The younger athletes that are graduating now who are shockingly ignorant of history, can't string a sentence together, but very often are the quickest to kneel for any cause. I think you see it across the board in our culture that younger generations, that's a statistic that you guys have talked about very eloquently, when you've got something like 57% of young millennials who see socialism positive. I think that's what we're in for a lot more of.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about postmodernism, because you wrote a book, The Renaissance and the Postmodern. It's amazing to me, the more I read about postmodernism, which I believe is the root of this problem. Would you agree with that first?
Absolutely.
Okay. But as I read about postmodernism and I see how it was designed, who it was designed by, why it was designed, I can't think of anything that is positive. It's all about destruction, and destruction of really bringing us back at best case scenario to the Renaissance, best case, where some thinkers are there, but they're going to be locked in a tower and they have to keep it secret and they have to write in code.
Yeah, I think the fundamental premise of all progressive because progressivism is behind this. And I've made this argument many times. I think the single underreported story about our university campuses, forget the intolerance, forget the bias response teams, forget all that. I think the biggest problem we have, and no one's talking about it, is how did we allow radically leftist, activist political philosophy to be the way we force kids to read books across the humanities, whether you're in art history or philosophy or English or sociology or anthropology. You are reading books now when you get them, not for what the books say, but you're reading them as feminist readings or Marxist readings or environmentalist readings. The entire methodology of postmodernism is deconstructive. There's actually a philosophy called deconstruction. An obscure French theorist by the name of Jacques Derrida formulated it. And the entire premise is that words don't mean what they say they mean if you want them not to. And so you go through books rather than trying to learn from them, rather than trying to stand on the shoulders of giants and add to the common civilizational knowledge of the last 2,000 years of Western culture. You are instead taking an axe to the very root of liberty, of equality, of freedom, of reason, of logic. I mean, we see the degree to which, even in the math and science programs now on college campuses, they're calling the scientific method a holdover of white supremacy. The emphasis on logic and correct answers in math classes and Common Core, you guys have talked about this. It's not so important anymore that holding kids accountable to a standard of math is itself a kind of oppression. And so you're right. It's exactly right. It's completely deconstructive. It's a wrecking ball. And I tell my students every day, the first day of every class, I say, with postmodernism, you don't have to contribute anything. You just have to know how to knock things over. It's easy to knock things down. It's really hard to build them.
So what is the answer? I mean, you know, you're getting press because you put this statement out, and it's incredible to me that you have to do that. It's incredible to me that you've made the statement, you know, hey, most kids are open to giving books a chance. What? I mean, it's incredible. What is the solution to this cancer that is eating at us?
I honestly think there are a lot of solutions, and they're at a lot of levels. Some of it's financial, parents pulling their kids out. The fact that a lot of our kids really are going to college because they think they have to, they don't really need to. But if you ask me as a professor of English, and you know, I think I'm the only conservative English professor I've met in 25 years as a professor. I can't think of 7 different universities. I can't think of another one I've worked with. And if you ask me, the single biggest problem we have is exactly that. If you allow kids to read the great books of Western culture as they are written, they will not turn out to be social justice warriors. 25 years ago when I got started, Glenn, what they were doing was they were putting the text of Western culture alongside postmodern texts. Mm-hmm. So kids got to read Shakespeare, but then they would read a feminist argument about Shakespeare. And 9 times out of 10, kids recognized that Shakespeare was greater than the feminist theory. He was a greater thinker. And then recently what we've done over the last 10 years is we've started removing the great authors over and over again, replacing in literature and history and philosophy highly politicized texts, right? So you're reading Ta-Nehisi Coates now in history rather than reading Adam Smith. And so you're already now reading books that start from a social justice mindset more than you're not. Then the theory that you're allowed to engage those books with is all progressive political activist left-wing theory. And so there is no way for kids now to even see through a clear window what the great minds of Western culture have thought. If we can go back to depoliticizing the way kids read books. Let kids first read Shakespeare or Milton or Chaucer from the context of the cultures that wrote them. Then we would go a long way to reclaiming sanity on a college campus. But of course, this is the one thing the professors don't want to do, because if they do that, then their social justice message gets watered down and undercut.
Yeah, if you're only teaching from the postmodern perspective, you can easily create this feeling that, well, you're just too stupid to get it. And you're just not in on the in crowd. And it's people who applaud when everybody else is applauding, or people who laugh. And it's a common instinct. People who laugh when everybody else is laughing, even though you don't really get the joke. But if you have something beside it, I've seen students who are starving for something that makes sense to them. And when they hear it, they're like, oh my gosh, how come I've never heard this before?
Bingo. I think the greatest compliment I've ever gotten as a teacher is not the "I love you, your classes are great, yeah. When I get kids come up to me and say to me, how come, Dr. Pesta, I'm 24 years old, how come I've never heard this before in my schooling? How come 20 years of school, no one's ever said this to me? It's really easy to blow away the smoke cloud of theoretical liberalism if you hit them with good ideas that are grounded in good arguments. That's what Western culture has done better than any culture, the great writers of Western culture, and yet it's so obscured to our kids. I'll give you a real short anecdote. First day of class, the kids were reading, this was just yesterday, kids were reading the first two acts of Measure for Measure, Shakespeare's great play, Measure for Measure. And so when we were talking about it, I asked them, I said, okay, so how'd you do? And one girl raised her hand and she said, look, it was very hard. I didn't really understand it. I said, okay, because no one's ever taught you to read Shakespeare. She goes, that's right. I said, so tell me what you took from it. She said, well, I could tell that the women were victims and the men were oppressors. And I said to her, how do you know that? She goes, honestly, because of my other classes. I don't know it from being able to read the play. And I said to her, have you ever read The Brothers Karamazov? She said, no. I said, right now, do for me a feminist reading of The Brothers Karamazov, even though you've never read it. The whole class laughed, and she looked at me for a second, and then she said, well, the men are oppressors and the women are victims. And I said, bingo. I said, to do the kind of progressive leftist readings that you are required to do in our English department, you don't even have to read stupid books anymore. You can just say what you said, and you have mastered, from our perspective, what we want you to take away from books, but you will know nothing about what the actual text said. And she agreed with me.
Wow, I wish there were more people like you in the university. Duke, thank you so much. I hope to meet you someday. I know you are instrumental and have been in Common Core and getting that beast exposed. And I just thank you for your courage. Thank you for continuing to stand, not giving in. For anybody who's a new professor or a young professor, got any tips?
Don't keep your powder dry. What I was told is keep your powder dry till you get tenure and then speak your mind. I never did it. It cost me a lot of trouble. But looking back at my life now as a professor, I'm glad I spoke out even before I wasn't protected. Because if we start doing more of that, there's more hope for all of us.
Dr. Duke, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
You bet. You can find him at Duke Pesta, Pesta, or the drdukeshow.com. I think that's a show I want to watch.